Alexander Graham Bell's invention of the telephone.
Created by Jessica Presley and Haley Mickler.
Alexander Graham Bell's invention of the telephone has changed communication in the world today. On March 10th, 1876, Bell designed the telephone.
Alexander Graham Bell, or Alec, was born on March 3, 1847 in Edinburgh, Scotland, in a shoemaker family. Bell's family was never content with the way things were in the world. They always wanted improvements.
Bell was fascinated by human speech and the science that made it possible since his youth. He was a public speaker, a speech teacher at Weston House, and he was studying human communication. Bell studied Hermann von Helmholtz's studies of a telegraph, but he could not read it because it was in German. So instead he interpreted the diagrams, but he misunderstood them, thinking the sound was transmitted electrically. This wrong belief inspired the invention of the telephone.
As Alexander Graham Bell joined the race to the invention of the telephone, he needed assistance in the process. Thomas Sanders, Gardiner Green Hubbard, and Thomas Watson helped Bell with his work.
Elisha Gray and Thomas Edison were Bell's competitors to become the rich person that would improve human communication for the future. They were frantically creating multiple designs for the perfect telephone.
On June 2, 1875, Alec and Watson were tuning reeds in the multiple telegraph transmitters when an accident happened that resulted in a breakthrough. Watson plucked the reed with the electric current off, and in the next room, Alec heard faint noise over the transmitter that was connected to Watson's receiver. They discovered that the reed could send sounds as complex as a human voice. That was when he finally understood how the telephone would work.
On February 14, 1876, Hubbard filed the patent application to beat Elisha Gray. 2 hours later, Gray filed hers, but the design would not work. Bell's would. Bell received a patent called Improvements in Telegraphy, and on March 7, 1876, they had the right to sell and make telephones in the U.S. for 19 years.
Finally, on March 10, 1876, Bell made a new telephone design. Alec made communications to Watson, who was in a room about 15 feet away with the receiver. Watson heard a crackle and then the words, "Mr. Watson, come here, I want to see you," coming from Bell's transmitter connected to the receiver, and thus the telephone was invented.
That day reformed human communication in the world. In 1876, a New York World editor wrote, "Of what use is such an invention? Well, there may be occasions of state when it is necessary for officials who are far apart to talk with each other, or some lover may wish to pop the question directly into the ear of a lady and hear for himself her reply, though miles away. It is not for us to guess how a courtship will be carried on in the 20th century."
Some of the public were against the telephone, though. Citizens of Boston created a petition against the use of the telephone, but others were hopeful about the telephone. Kate Field, an American journalist, helped Bell promote the telephone in London in 1878. She said, "Before long we shall sit down, fold our arms, and let electricity do everything for us. We'll go to bed and get up by electricity. We'll write by electricity and see by the same means. I've just read of the electroscope, the province of which is to transmit waves of light by electricity. Combine it with the telephone, and while two persons hundred of miles are talking together, they will actually see each other."
Bell went on many tours to make speeches about his telephone. At the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, Bell publicly demonstrated the telephone to the crowd. A cartoon was published called the Daily Graphic, which portrayed the telephone as an evil communication.
Years later, the telephone can be found in 90% of American households in the 1970s. The telephone was used in the first long-distance call between Bell and his father in August of 1876. Bell was in Paris, Ontario, and Bell's father was in Brantford, about 8 miles away. The telephone now is used all over the world by government officials and in people's everyday lives.
On January 25, 1915, the first telephone line opened. Bell was in New York, where he called Watson in San Francisco and delivered the same message from when he first spoke in the telephone.
The revolutionary design of the telephone made it possible to instantly communicate verbally with people in a community or around the world, rather than waiting for postal mail to arrive. Imagine a life without having the means to converse with relatives and friends who live far away. Without Bell's design, It would be questionable if we would even have a telephone. But thankfully, this great invention succeeded.
Though his ideas were questioned at first, people began to accept the telephone and the concept of its use. Improvements were underway and already changing the first design. This still continues today, as we create cellular phones and telephones. Bell wrote, "With the telephone, it is possible to connect every man's house, office, or factory with a central station, so as to give him direct communication with his neighbors." Today, this invention reformed life in America.